Hello and welcome to our third and final briefing by the University of Galway in Ireland. This is a briefing delivered by the Rhine Institute for Sustainability and also in combination with the Master's Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security at the University of Galway. My name is Professor Charlie Spillane. I'm the Director of the Rhine Institute and also the Director of the Master's Program on Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security. So at each COP27, what we do is we try to develop briefings that are partnership between the Rhine Institute and our master's program, where the students based in Galway analyze what is happening at COP27, and then us faculty who are here on the ground at each of the COP26 and also at COP27 in this case, try to connect from the COP with the students. So this is our briefing format essentially for that. So what we do is the students do a briefing. They analyze what is happening at COP27 in relation to looking from the outside in, and then we invite commentaries from people, including ourselves here on the ground at COP27, on what their reflections are in relation to the progress of the negotiations. So I guess we can think a little bit about where do things stand at present. With one point, we're about 1.5 weeks into COP27 at the present. This has been dubbed the implementation COP, and we can rightly ask questions into what extent, what aspects of implementation the negotiations here have been moved forward by the time that COP27 ends, likely next Sunday or so. But negotiations of intentions and pledges are really important. It's quite clear that accelerated implementation of mitigation measures across all sectors and all countries will be really critical to keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees. And we should be aware that these negotiations have been underway for 30 years. So it's clear that these negotiations, by their nature almost, are incremental. They make incremental progress. But then, we can ask the question, to what extent transformational progress that is necessary to stay within 1.5 degrees is being enabled by the negotiations here of the UNFCCC and of the Paris Agreement. There are multiple parallel negotiations underway here, and they relate to different articles or sections of the Paris Agreement, and each of those negotiations incrementally adds detail and clarity on how they can be interpreted and implemented by member state governments. And we should be aware that governments interact on many fronts, and it's essential that the channels of diplomacy are kept open, and as this has a bearing on how consensus can be forged. For instance, the G20 meeting that's underway in Bali has facilitated a meeting between the Presidents Biden and President Xi Jinping, and that meeting, rapprochement, essentially has raised prospects for resumption of climate talks between China and the USA by their climate envoys. And that's critically important because China and the USA are two of the major kind of emitting countries and critical to emissions mitigation. It's an important development that has happened today, essentially, is that the leaders of the G20 have pledged to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And that's an important political signal to the negotiators here at COP27 to ensure that the 1.5 degree, the slogan of keeping 1.5 degree alive is maintained, and that ambition is maintained, that it is not lost and given up on. So this kind of brings me to, the final days of COP27. And in the final days of these negotiations, the negotiations tend to focus on the cover decision of the COP. And this is really the kind of key outcomes of the talks over the 2 weeks, outlining how countries are going to seek to fulfill the aims of the Paris Agreement. So the elements document of the conference decision, they came out last night, and they act as a barometer in a sense for where progress is being made and what issues are falling off the agenda or being raised on the agenda, or where boundaries are being pushed. And you can look for when new issues are agreed or what's missing from these cover decisions of each COP. The cover decisions of this COP will clearly cover the main outcomes which have been negotiated over the past 2 weeks, such as those as the Global Goal on Adaptation, Loss and Damage, Mitigation Work Programme, Financing, and others. Indeed, kind of climate financing was really an overarching issue at this COP, and the final outcomes will be critical to, I guess, determining whether this COP27 is considered a success. And key topics are like loss and damage, adaptation finance, transparency, post-2025 finance goals, possible reform of multilateral development banks by next April, as called for by John Kerry, and so forth. So there's a whole range of kind of rather complex kind of finance issues that are under negotiation with big implications for large amounts of money. Like climate change, the biodiversity crisis is an interlinked crisis that has existential implications for humanity. It's critically important that the negotiations here in relation to climate change and the parallel negotiations in relation to biological diversity and the Convention on Diversity, that they remain coherent. So it'll be worth seeing to what extent biodiversity features in the COP27 outcomes and to what extent climate change will feature in the upcoming COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will be held in December. There are concepts such as nature-based solutions to climate change that may be interpreted in different ways and contested by different member states. Possible conflicts may arise in relation to that. There's a strong push on for a Paris Agreement for nature at COP15, so it's one to keep an eye on. Energy is almost certainly going to feature in the cover decision. And in one sense, the entire climate change challenge is one of energy, particularly how quickly humanity can transition to affordable clean energy sources at scale. India, for instance, is gathering support for a proposal to phase down all fossil fuels at COP27, and so it remains to be seen whether that will feature in the cover decisions. At COP26, there was a statement about a decision to phase down coal. So if a decision to phase down all fossil fuels will be much broader and have much more political kind of significance. And on the food and agriculture front, there's the Coronivia joint program on agriculture, which is being negotiated over a number of years. And there hasn't really been much progress on that front. It would seem that there are no significant outcomes as of yet in relation to that program. And it's quite likely that the negotiation process for that will continue beyond COP27. So really, the cover decision is worth keeping an eye on. I think it's important for the students and for anybody who wants to follow these political negotiations in relation to climate change to focus on, what is in and what is outside these cover decisions. And it's quite likely that the cover decision text negotiations will go down to the last minute, possibly into next Sunday. So at that, I'm going to hand over to our students. So this is group 3. We've had 3 groups of students. We've done one briefing and then a second briefing, and this is our third briefing at this point of the negotiations. And I'm going to hand over to our students who've been analysing a lot what has been happening since last Friday, since our last briefing in relation to COP27. So over to the students, and thanks so much to the audience and to our students for doing this as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Spillane, for that introduction. This briefing, titled From Talk to Action, will discuss the developments on key issues of COP27 from Friday, November 11th until today, and what we expect to occur in the closing days of the conference. Our presentation was created by the following group members: myself, Nicole, Tatenda, Darius, Linda, Sarah, and Patience. Linda, Darius, and I will be presenting on behalf of our group, all of whom participated in research and development of this briefing. As we near the closing days of COP27, one trend that is clear is a continuing call for wealthy countries to step up and fulfill their pledges for emissions cuts and climate finance, and to commit to pledges for loss and damage. Echoing sentiments from COP26, we've seen throughout this conference that policymakers, non-state actors, and members of civil society are really frustrated by perpetual dialogue with little tangible action. Some small symbolic progress has been made. For example, COP27 President Sameh Shoukry emphasized the importance of the negotiations between China and the United States, who on Monday agreed to maintain communication on the issue of climate change. Generally, the closing of the first week of the Conference of Parties marks a midpoint in policy negotiations, but a deadline for subsidiary bodies who act as a link between the scientific community and policy-oriented aspects of the COP. This week, the closing plenaries of the Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technological Advice and Subsidiary Body for Implementation brought a few agreements, but parties were unable to reach agreements on really crucial issues like cooperative implementation of the Paris Agreement and national adaptation plans. Draft texts full of brackets, which are used to mark where texts have still got disagreements, were forwarded for a continued review during week 2 of the COP, with many party members expressing disappointment at that lack of progress. Key issues still underway for negotiation in week 2 include emissions targets, loss and damage, climate finance, water, women and gender, waste, and adaptation and agriculture. Yesterday, the EU announced an updated emissions goal of 57% cut by 2050. This is 2% higher than their previous pledge of 55%. However, in general, sufficient pledges for target emissions have still not been agreed upon, making new reports from Carbon Brief on the carbon budget even more alarming. Current emissions target pledges. These are pledges only, not actual action or implementation, do not keep warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or below. The Global Carbon Project, or GCP, estimates show 2022 having the highest level of CO2 emissions to date. The GCP also estimated that the remaining carbon budget from 2023 onward, or the amount of CO2 that can be released into the atmosphere before 1.5 degrees warming is surpassed, is approximately 380 gigatons, represented by this blue bar here in the graph on the right. This carbon budget would take about 9 years to use up. On Friday, Carbon Brief released a report disagreeing with this carbon budget. Using data from the IPCC and data from 2022 emissions reports, Carbon Brief estimates the remaining budget to be closer to 260 gigatons, represented by the green bar here on the right. This is projected to take about 6.5 years to use up, 2.5 years sooner than our 9-year budget. This new estimate thus demonstrates the increasing urgency for actionable emissions targets from all parties. COP27 president remarked that keeping 1.5 alive is really foundational for all the other work that is done at COP27 and every future COP, as every policy from loss and damage to agriculture hinges on that 1.5 degree goal, beyond which adaptation and mitigation needs could really be beyond our ability to address. Loss and damage continues to be one of the most spotlighted and divisive conversations at COP27. With much needed funding for disaster relief hanging in the balance, developing countries again on Saturday doubled down on their call for developed countries to pay up. In response to this, many developed nations have avoided concrete pledges for loss and damage, and even continue to dispute the language that is used to discuss the issue, preferring to move away from words like liability and compensation, which indicate responsibility. On Monday, Julio Cardano from Chile and Germany's Ursula Fuentes offered up an elements paper on loss and damage that aims to fit everybody's ideas in a single place. However, there is a question about whether or not this document can serve as a basis for negotiation, because a lot of the parties feel their views are not fully or accurately expressed. Some also claim that previously agreed upon details on the scope of the agenda are not accurately portrayed in this document. Consultations will continue between the parties in the last few days of COP27. On Monday, Germany and G7 countries officially launched the Global Shield Against Climate Risks, which bundles climate risk insurance and prevention. With a system like this, the initiative aims to be able to get financing to disaster-struck areas really quickly, reducing the number of follow-on effects and speeding up economic recovery. Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Ghana, which are countries with high risk and high loss and damage due to impacts of climate change, will be among the first recipients of this Climate Shield funding. In turn, the World Bank launched the Global Shield Financing Facility, which will support Global Shield climate risks by providing advisory, policy, and finance services. Essentially, they'll help move the funds when the funds are needed. They'll also partner with civil society organizations, humanitarian organizations, and the private sector to finance climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction projects. While this effort does provide some much-needed funding to vulnerable countries, many feel that initiatives like this are merely diversionary tactics to pull engagement away from the conversations on loss and damage. Others still argue that insurance is not the way to deal with the issue of loss and damage, as this system leaves room for the highest risk areas to become uninsurable, and this could leave the most vulnerable out to dry. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Linda, who will begin by giving an update on the issue of climate finance.
Thanks, Nicole. The commitment to provide adaptation finance for the most vulnerable communities, which has been promised by the Paris Climate Agreement, has been a major discussion at COP27. 8 countries have pledged a total of $105.6 million in funding to the Least Developed Countries Fund at COP27. These countries are Denmark, Finland, Germany, Ireland, Slovenia, Sweden, Switzerland, and Belgium. These countries also highlighted the need for more support for the Global Environmental Facility Funds, which targets adaptation needs of developing countries. Political support of this funding was supported by Belgium, Canada, France, and the US, with some of these countries indicating that a further contribution will be made in the coming months. These funds were welcomed by developing countries and urged other countries to also step up on funding. These new pledges add to $413 million that was pledged by 12 countries to the Least Developed Countries Fund at COP26. Ireland is committed to increasing their international climate finance. As part of the commitment to provide $225 million per year in climate finance by 2025, a more than doubling of their support, the Minister for Irish Transport and Environmental Minister and leader of the Green Party, Eamon Ryan, has announced a funding package of €24 million at COP24 to support climate action in developing countries. This includes new funding of over €18 million, which was announced on Monday, the 14th of November. Of this €18 million package, €1 million is pledged for the Special Climate Fund in order to support small islands to allow for adaptation. The funding agreed by Eamon Ryan includes $5 million of the $10 million that was pledged by the Irish Prime Minister, or Taoiseach, Micheál Martin, for the Global Shield Fund. Both general and food waste are major contributors to carbon issues. From plastic waste alone, the expected net emissions are to increase on current trajectories to 309 million tonnes by 2050. When focusing on just 1 kilogram of food waste, 2.5 kilograms of carbon dioxide alone are emitted from such wastage. However, negotiations on global waste, in particular that from food, have brought about positive action during COP27. On the 11th of November 2022, the Egyptian Pact was signed. This pact focuses on used beverage carton waste and brings together groups from across the value chain to address the end-to-end process of recycling cartons and preventing waste. Private companies at COP27, such as Tetra and Uniboard, are jointly investing €2.5 million to develop infrastructure for recycling to meet the terms of this Egyptian Pact. The promotion of incorporating food waste into countries' NDCs at COP27 can be seen as a win for the reductions on emissions from food waste. Currently, only 21 countries have food waste reduction incorporated into their NDCs. However, reducing food waste alone can cut global methane emissions by up to 15%. Therefore, raising awareness of the need to include this in NDCs at COP27 was significant. Water Day focused on harnessing water security action into the global climate agenda. Water was said to be a huge disaster that needed urgent attention, as reports shared during the briefings indicated serious concerns. About 40% of the world's population is affected by water scarcity. Almost 80% of wastewater is being discharged untreated into the environment. Nearly 90% of disasters are water-related. The biggest highlight of the day was the inauguration of the initiative AWARE by the COP27 presidency. AWARE was launched in partnership with the World Meteorological Organization as a strategy to promote inclusive cooperation on discussions and actions addressing water as a key to climate change adaptation and resilience, including partnerships for early warming systems and early action. It will focus on aid for the most vulnerable communities and ecosystems in Africa as a first step. The main mission being to support already existing water policies, to provide means of water policy implementation where possible, to support and finance operational tools, example, early warning systems, monitoring systems, and information platforms, and methods for climate change cooperative and inclusive action. The World Resources Institute and partners also launched the African Cities Water Adaptation Fund with the aim of channeling $5 billion towards urban water resilience solutions in 100 African cities by 2032. As the World Health Organization reported that about half the world's population will be living in water-stressed areas by 2025, there was pressure to come up with sustainable adaptation and mitigation solutions to the water crisis. I will now hand you over to my colleague Darius, who will speak on women and gender.
Thank you, Linda. I'll be looking into women in climate change. Women agency is the ability for women to choose, navigate, and negotiate their future and develop their adaptive capacity. Women continue to bear a disproportionate burden of the adverse effects of climate change. The Gender Day focused on women and climate change finance, which highlighted gender-responsive climate financing. The African women were also at the center of discussion as they talked about challenges women face and how best they can be empowered to respond to climate change impacts. Women livelihood within just economic transitions gave a detailed insight on leverage opportunities for women living in different communities and support, such as urban, rural, and coastal areas within environmentally just transitions. Women groups are optimistic that COP27 will adopt a final registration of gender action plan and put it into effect. Moving on to adaptation and agriculture. Adaptation and agriculture was a key thematic day of COP27 on November 12th. The Coroneva Joint Work on Agriculture established a unique potential agriculture has in tackling climate and the need for adaptation strategies to improve resilience. Work continues on agriculture places in the climate negotiations through discussions on the Coroneva Joint Work on Agriculture in the draft document Enhanced KJWA, focusing on the need to strengthen farmers' resilience to climate change through adaptation. On the 12th of November, farmer representatives at COP27 called for negotiations to move on to allow for discussions on implementing practical actions on KJWA and how farmers can address climate change through this framework. Confirmation that KJWA discussions would continue into week 2 of COP27 came through on Monday, the 14th of November. However, while continued discussions on climate change and agriculture through KJWA can be seen as a win for farmers and organizations concerned with the food system, the term Coroneva crisis has emerged during this COP, which reinforces public doubt in achievement of an agreement on this topic during COP27, fueled by a lack of political will and ambition to implement action. Moving on to conclusions. Okay, looking ahead, biodiversity talks are taking place today, focusing on how to halt biodiversity loss that will have impacted through climate change and pollution. Stakeholders such as youth groups, civil society, the private sector, NGOs, and governments will want to scale up action and urgency based on the global biodiversity framework. Loss and damage, slow progress, and continued blockage from developed countries remain major barriers to deal with. One major disagreement is around rhetoric. Some arguing that the conversation should be about liabilities, others think more progressively, and the conversation should be focused on humanitarianism, emphasizing purely the importance of aiding victims of climate-related disasters, through whichever lenses the details of exactly how and how much money will be given by each country remain inconclusive and divisive. 50 by 2050, Egypt is expected to launch a global waste initiative, 50 by 2050, for Africa for a global impact on COP27 Solution Day, taking place Thursday, November 17th. The initiative aims to recycle and treat at least 50% of Africa's waste by 2050, working towards the broader aim of bringing more attention to the importance of waste in climate change conversations. UNGA resolution on the rights of people against adverse impacts of climate change. The draft of this document will be released Friday, 10 a.m., outlining the advisor opinion on the International Court of Justice on state obligations to protect the rights against the impacts of climate change under international law. There's a push for all countries in the UN General Assembly to vote in favor of this resolution. Thank you for your attention. We look forward to seeing what happens in the final days of COP27. Back to you, Professor Spillane.
Sure, if I'm up something. Okay. Thanks so much, and I'd like to thank all of the students for that excellent and comprehensive analysis of what's happening at COP27. I think it's really like testament to your commitment and motivation to be able to analyze what's going on from the outside looking in relation to these particular kind of negotiations. I think Helen Pankhurst said this week that today's climate protesters and change agents will be seen as future heroes in the same way that her grandmother and great-grandmother were seen as heroes for women's equality. So on that basis, I'd like to thank our talented and very motivated climate change students for the really comprehensive analysis that you provide in relation to COP27. So at that, I'm going to hand over. We're basically trying to connect the students in Galway with people who are here in COP27 in Egypt, and so we have a range of invited commentators that have taken some time out of their busy schedules here to be with us. So at that, I'm going to hand over to Kayla Shai, who's actually I'm going to hand over to Una Murray first, okay, who's a member of our faculty in Galway, who's also here at COP27 to hear Una's reflections, and then I'm going to hand over to Kayla Shai, who's an ex-graduate of us from the Climate Change and Master Students program. So I'm going to hand over to Una first, and then to Kayla, and then I'll subsequently get around to everybody else. Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. And I won't stay on too long because we've quite a lot of speakers here. Just to say, I've been following the displacement and human migration side events, and this is linked to the loss and damage political dialogue. And there was a closed meeting today on loss and damage, although observers were allowed in later. But the good news is that the text to operationalize the Santiago network on loss and damage has been agreed to provide technical assistance to countries suffering from loss and damage. And the text also includes, well, indirectly, the human rights are acknowledged in the text, the needs of vulnerable people, Indigenous peoples, I think, and the local community. So this text will pass on to the COP27 presidency, and the next battle, I suppose, is the financial mechanism or the financial facility. And Linda has already organized or outlined very carefully the different positions on the global shield and financing. But I've been at a number of talks in the Climate Mobility Hub and with loads of different actors, but just ActionAid from Bangladesh gave a really heart-wrenching talk today about, and this links to what Daria said, about gender and women being very much affected by disasters and having to move due to floods and move on again. And their roles make them very, vulnerable. And people are moving to urban slums, and the slums are not prepared for the influx. And I think she mentioned in Bangladesh, over 13 million people are moving to cities, and it's very hard to provide services. And there's examples of offloading children, which is a horrible phrase, and trafficking increasing, especially for girls, and also for slow onset events. There seems to be a lot of horrible things happening as well. So as Nicole said, you know, everything hinges on this 1.5, and if we don't stick to this 1.5, you know, the predictions for more displacements and movements of populations in Africa will really increase. And a very interesting report came out this week called the African Shifts Report, which has, you know, predictions of movements. So displacement is a very sensitive issue, and, you know, most people don't want to move. There's all these issues of ancestral homes and land issues and loss of identity. But some countries are already faced with relocating their populations. And we know that from the small island states. I think Fiji has already started to, has moved about 48 communities. So this is a gap in the NDCs, just as Linda spoke about the gap on plastics, there's a gap about displacement and migration in the NDCs. So they're the most things that I've been following. I suppose the kind of mantra is to try and have cooperation that will help to avert, minimize and address displacement in the context of climate change. Back to you, Charlie.
Thanks very much, Una. And so that's really great. So right next, I'm going to hand over to one of our graduates, Takelo Shai. Takelo is currently at COP27 as a fellow advising the high-level champions, and she has other climate-related activities. So I'll let Takelo introduce herself, what she's doing here at COP27 and her reflections on COP27. So over to you, Takelo.
Great, thanks very much, Charlie, and thanks for the invitation to the briefing here today. I actually just left COP. I was there the whole of last week, and I'm back in South Africa as of Monday. And what I was doing there is also just a bit of a background as to what it is I'm doing, is that I'm working as a fellow with the Climate Champions team. And what the Climate Champions team does is that we work to support the two high-level climate champions, which is Nigel Topping from COP26 and Mahmoud Mohilding. And these are the two champions that are selected by each of the running COP presidencies. And part of their role is to accelerate climate action among non-state actors, but also try to strengthen the collaboration between parties and non-party stakeholders. So there's a team of us that work around the champions in various sectors. And I currently sit in the nature team, but particularly in the food and agriculture space. So part of what we were doing at COP was essentially running through all of our work since April, at least for me, but since the past 2 years, and also trying to land some of the initiatives that we see as having high-level impact. And I'm glad to see that some of those have already been mentioned in the briefings already. For example, the Sharm El-Sheikh adaptation agenda, that is part of the work we've been working on with various partners to try and land at COP27. So my week has largely been centered around tracking some of those initiatives that particularly relates to food and agriculture, adaptation and agriculture day. But we also were working closely with some of the presidency initiatives, which one of that was FAST, which was launched on Saturday. And also part of what we've also been following is the Aim for C, which was initially launched last year at COP26, but they increased some of the investment this year at COP27. So part of those broader presidency initiatives is what we work around to support. And then we also work on some of the non-state actor initiatives. So particularly in the food and agriculture space, what we were trying to push on food and, or rather adaptation and agriculture day was highlighting the adaptation agenda, which is one of the implementation labs that I was strongly working on with partners such as the FAO, World Economic Forum, and I think Ban Ki-moon was also one of the main partners that ran that event with us. And we're trying to elevate some of that message in that event. And then also part of the work we've been doing the past few months was supporting the Breakthrough Agenda, which was initially launched last year, but also strengthening some of that messaging at COP27 as well. And there's also some Africa initiatives that have been launched where I sit in the team as well as an African, and that being some of the Aqua Fund, which you've mentioned here today, And I think also one which was launched on Monday was the Carbon Markets Initiative. And part of that also fits within the cross-cutting area of food and agriculture. So that's mainly what I've been focusing on, but also just in terms of reflections of COP, it was my first COP. It's been quite interesting just being on the ground and seeing some of the work that people are sharing. I think in terms of reflection, it's mainly a landing stage for a lot of work that's been done in the past years, the past few months or the past year. So it's just quite interesting to see how that gets scaled and gets recognized on the ground. But I definitely think you don't really have a full view of what's happening when you're on the ground. And I think you guys probably have much more of a view of that than what we do. So I'm looking forward to catching up on what has actually happened from the outside and also just reflecting on what we've also put out. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Takelo, and I guess it's really inspiring for us in the university to see graduates such as yourself going on to do such kind of important work. So we're delighted to see that. But I'd like to move on to our next commentator who's taken time out of our schedule, Mette Lund from the ILO Just Transition Pavilion. And Mette, we'd really like to hear from yourself in terms of ILO's kind of presence here and the big issues for ILO and, you know, the whole question of kind of just transition and what your reflections are on COP27. That would be really wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Charles, and hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Those of you who have been here on the ground know how extremely loud it is everywhere. So I'll try and speak loud, but if there's any issues with the sound and whatnot, let me know. But thank you so much for inviting the ILO. As you said, my name is Mette. I work in the Green Jobs team in the ILO, which is the UN specialized agency for everything related to the world of work. So before I reflect on COP, I'm just gonna take a minute to explain what is the ILO, what is the UN agency for labor doing at COP, and why do we have a mandate within the climate change agenda. And that's really because we know that climate change is not only changing our environment, our climate, it's also changing our economies, the way that we work, people's lives. As we see crises and natural disasters all over the world, that's pretty obvious. And that impact and the response to it is what we call a just transition. So a just transition is ambitious climate action coupled with social justice, decent work, the labor dimension within the climate change agenda. So what I thought that I would talk a little bit about is the first just transition and how it is embedded into the climate change negotiations. Then I wanted to cover 3 reflections on just transition and the social dimension of climate change in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and finance. And then, in case then I think I don't have more time. So that's what I want to cover. First of all, within the UN agency, within the international framework, we only have one internationally agreed upon document on what just transition is, and those are the ILO guidelines for just transition. They were agreed upon in 2015. And this is a really strong document because it was agreed upon by both governments, workers, so labor unions, and employers organizations, so the private sector. And these guidelines and the just transition paradigm was also included in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So it says that the Paris Agreement should be taking into account the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with nationally defined development priorities. So I think it was Takelo who mentioned that this COP here in Sharm feels a little bit like a landing scale or a plateau, or like the starting boxes of the big race where towards implementation. And I agree, but at the same time, what we've been seeing is that it's been more like making almost like a parking spot where people are now reversing back. And that has certainly been the case on the just transition agenda. So the negotiations that we've been following have been quite concerning, because actually last year at Glasgow, we saw that, for example, just transition and the decent work agenda was included in, for example, the texts on Article 6. So both in the preambles and some sort of contextual texts of Article 6.2 and 6.4 that are also being negotiated this year. But what we're seeing is that just transition and the considerations of work and the world of work is not being included. So as the previous speakers were saying, that there is reference to, for example, human rights and other types of sort of social justice issues, including, of course, gender equality, which are also things that are embedded in the just transition guidelines. But the language of just transition is not being included in the same way that we were hoping for. So that means that we are seeing that previously agreed upon language is not being included in the text and the negotiations this year as we were expecting and hoping. So something else I wanted to say is that just transition has previously been understood more as a mitigation topic. So as we obviously decarbonize, it's pretty clear how that will impact the labor market. Some jobs will be lost, more jobs will be created, but most importantly, a lot of jobs will be transformed or substituted. So the argument and the understanding of just transition has been pretty clear within the mitigation agenda, but not so much within adaptation and finance. So I think what we've been trying to also do, for example, through the Just Transition Pavilion that I'm sitting in right now, has been to include the Just Transition perspective, so the social dimension of climate change across all these different climate change issues, and that includes adaptation. Because obviously, as companies, as people, as jobs, as governments are adapting to climate change, this will also have a job dimension and a job implication. And that, if we don't include that, that will be a really big blind spot. And that would mean that the agreements and the solutions towards adaptation will also have this blind spot. The last thing I wanted to say is, of course, on finance, we're trying to follow this closely as well. And while there is more talk about just transition financing, for example, in the JETPs, we are a little bit concerned about how the J in these JETPs are being understood. Something that I wanted all of you to remember, if there's one thing you take away from my little briefing here or my little summary, it is that just transition has to be founded in these core principles of just transition. So that means social dialogue, the involvement of social partners, workers, employers in making these plans and for climate action, for adaptation, for mitigation, for finance. We want to make sure that it's founded in labor rights. We want to make sure that it's founded in gender equality. And this we're not necessarily seeing is the case in some of these just transition financing initiatives. So we have to make sure that, especially within financing that is being branded as just transition finance, that it includes the stakeholders that are going to be involved and impacted, both from the investments, but also from the projects that come from that investment. The last thing that I wanted to say is that we have been, what we hope to see and what we will be continuing to work on in our COP engagements is the inclusion of just transition and the elements of it in the NDCs and in the NAPs. So we have seen some examples of just transition being included to a larger degree in NDCs, which is great. We have to make sure that the NDCs are holistically addressing the topics. So that includes things like skilling and reskilling, the greening of SMEs, building out social protection floors, things like that. And the same goes for national adaptation plans. So that's maybe like an area to watch. And I think especially for all of you here that are interested within the food and agricultural sector, just transition is really, really crucial. We will be seeing transformations within the economy, the sectors, and the labor markets within these sectors, both in terms of mitigation, but certainly also in adaptation. So I think that is going to be my short summary here. But of course, if there's anything that you want me to elaborate or anything like that, feel free to write me in the chat, or we can follow up bilaterally. Thanks.
Mette, thanks so much, and thanks very much for taking the time to get across the perspective and the issues that are crucial to the ILO and to the Just Transition initiative, essentially. So that's really wonderful. So right now, and thank you again. Right now I'm going to hand over to Sebastian Ruiz, who is at the Cryosphere Pavilion, and Sebastian can explain to us the Cryosphere Pavilion, what it's trying to achieve, and also what the issues are in relation to the cryosphere here at COP27. So over to you, Sebastian. And thanks so much, Mette, for joining us today. Appreciate it very much.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, hear you fine.
Okay. Well, I'm at the Cryosphere Pavilion of the ICCI. And I'm a researcher from Chile into cryosphere research. So this is my comment from the COP27. And basically about me, I'm a postdoc researcher in Chile in the Catholic University, and I deal with different elements of the cryosphere, which are under current forcing and in the water management design, water security spheres. And so the key climate issue that I'm particularly interested in, and why they called me from the Cryosphere Pavilion, is about permafrost, which is one element of the cryosphere. And the issues are locally, the scarce monitoring in the Andes, but also in many other places. And also the conflict of interest that protected areas that cover glaciers and cover for example, other protected areas like Antarctica, have with certain interest of exploitation or intervention. So the basic issues in evolving cryosphere environments imply the evolving timescales for supply, which is related, as I said, to water security concerns. And in specific, the dimension of storage, recharge, and discharge, which is how the hydrological budget and the hydrological cycle in high mountains will be redefined. And this will bear the future impacts of maybe enacting deeper groundwater flows, affecting supply and quality, and changing the patterns of discharge, which are related to food security and bearing also ecological impacts crossing certain thresholds of security. The recent research that I do is basically in the mountains, where we deal with the problem of data deserts, which is also the case, for example, in the Himalayas and certain isolated areas in the Arctic Circle or in Antarctica as well. And basically in these big mountains, we intend to characterize and define well what is the current status, the baseline, so that we can upscale these findings and try to understand how subcontinental scales of water supply can evolve, but for considering the start of the hydrological cycle. And not only data deserts in terms of spatial scale, but also seasonal scale. And these issues are something that deal with the logistics and all the funding that cryosphere research requires. And this is also a subject of making the governments understand that there are priorities for delivering even more resources for solving these data gaps or data deserts. So my reflections on the COP27 so far, during this week at least, is that the emphasis on international cooperation deals with understanding the new priorities in different areas and in different parts of the hydrological cycle that include certain cryosphere elements. For example, today it was agreed and signed by different countries, the bilateral agreement between Iceland and Chile, where I'm from. And this was signed by different countries which are concerned about melting ice in certain landscapes containing mountains and different cryosphere elements. And this was carried with the help of the Cryosphere Pavilion that is here and led by Pam Person. But also my reflections deal with how I see the convergence of key topics linked to cryosphere. For example, as other presenters, speakers have recently said in this briefing, water security deals also with infrastructure, but the prevention scale needs to account on the kind of research that is done on earth science spheres, geography, also human geography, etc., but also linked with veterinary medicine and food security. And further with also the risk assessment topics that deal with incoming infrastructure changes and impacts, which relate to cryosphere elements, for example, with avalanches, rockfall due to permafrost degradation in certain areas, and also, of course, with sea level rise. So in conclusion, as an excursus, the shortcoming that I see and a reflection from the COP27 is that data deserts are something that needs to be dealt and not seen only from a purely theoretical, conceptual type of research. And as a reflection, I see part of a future action plan, the need for a transdisciplinary feed forward, because we don't always have the space or the chance to do focus meetings and analyzing the future impacts in a cross-scale perspective. So this is basically what I had to share from our Cryosphere Pavilion, and thank you for the invitation to your briefing.
Thanks so much, Sebastian, and thanks for you know, I guess communicating to us the importance of the cryosphere and the impacts of climate change on the cryosphere, but also how the cryosphere, how that is changing its impact on the climate cycle. So we have one more commentator, and last but not least, we've Ross Fitzpatrick from Christian Aid in Ireland, and so I'm going to hand over to Ross in the interest of time, and then I'll just wrap up with a few words. Okay, so over to you, Ross. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Charlie. Just checking that I'm coming in loud and clear. I'm also wary that there's a lot of noise in the background. So can you hear me okay?
Hear you fine. Yep.
Great. So I'm just going to try and give a quick overview of Christian Aid's three main asks at this COP and comment briefly on where we are with the negotiations. So first of all, we're all acutely aware that we have a need to get our emissions down as quickly as possible, and it's been mentioned already, to keep the crucial 1.5 degree limit of warming alive. Current plans, including Ireland's, still have us on course for somewhere between 2.4 and 2.6 degrees warming, as the recent UNEP report confirmed. And we know Ireland is one of the highest emitters per capita in the EU, and our commitment to half emissions by 2030, while ambitious, still falls well short of our fair share of the global effort needed. So in terms of the negotiations, despite the statement from the G20, which was mentioned in one of the earlier presentations, the 1.5 degree limit is still very much on life support. Negotiators and the presidency have not been able to deliver a robust mitigation work program during week one. And during the pre-2030 ambition high-level roundtable, even though there was consensus regarding the cover decision committing to 1.5 degrees, still some countries are pushing for it not to be included in there. What's more, despite knowing that the 1.5, keeping the 1.5 limit alive means a fair phase out of all fossil fuels were not included in the first draft cover decision, which was published by the presidency on Monday. So as of right now, there's a lot of work still to do to ensure that we don't end up backsliding on the Glasgow Climate Pact. The The second thing I wanted to touch on was the need to step up and provide the financial support that has already been promised to developing countries. So a decade since being agreed, and it was mentioned, I think, in one of the earlier presentations, the 100 billion target has still not been met. OECD data has shown that 83 billion was provided in 2020, and the vast majority of this was in loans, so further adding to unsustainable debt burdens of developing countries. And in fact, a recent report from Oxfam estimates that around 21 to 24 billion in public climate finance was provided in 2020, so less than a third of the headline figure and just a quarter of what was promised. So in terms of the state of play on the finance negotiations, there are two parallel tracks that I've been following. The first being the long-term finance goal, or the 100 billion figure, and the second being the post-2025 goal, which has the wonderful acronym new NCQG, or the New Collective Quantified Goal. In terms of the negotiations, they've progressed slowly, and they've been largely procedural in nature. On the 100 billion goal, there's reports that it could be within reach in 2023, but global climate finance flows are still relatively small compared to the overall needs of the climate transition and the scale of resources needed by developing countries. On the NCQG, the negotiations have really only focused on the organization of technical expert dialogues and high-level ministerial dialogues to take place in the next year. So there's no discussion yet on a figure. It's really just deciding on next steps in the process. And some developing countries, including AOSIS, have aired their frustration at the real lack of ambition there. I was at one of the meetings today, for instance, and there was an hour-long discussion over which version of the text should form the basis of the discussions. And the negotiators were quite frustrated. So that gives a sense of where we are on the finance. And lastly, and where I'd like to focus the majority of my comments, is the issue of finance for loss and damage, which has been described as the litmus test for this COP. As Christian Aid, along with our partners in the Global South, we're calling for the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility. And so far, the negotiations on the funding arrangements before making any kind of conclusive decision in 2024. So in other words, all they've committed to is more talking, no action. The vast majority So yesterday, the G77 in China put forward a proposal outlining the process for getting the fund up and running, which would involve setting up an ad hoc or transitional committee to develop the objectives and operational modalities of the fund by COP28. And we've had some positive signals from the EU that it would be willing to consider this committee. But by and large, developed countries have remained steadfast in their opposition to the finance facility. Having said that, many countries, including Ireland, came into this COP stating that loss and damage was a key priority. And people may have seen last week, there were a number of pledges made for loss and damage by developed countries, including Ireland. Unfortunately, most of this funding has gone towards the Global Shield, which was mentioned already, an initiative which is led by Germany and driven through the G7 presidency. And Ireland committed 10 million euros to this. So before finishing up, just want to spend a couple of minutes unpacking the Global Shield and why it can't be a substitute for a dedicated financing fund under the UNFCCC. So first of all, the Global Shield, it's made up of 3 separate financing funds to help countries in the aftermath of climate disasters. The first of these funds would involve directing funds from wealthier countries to offset the cost of insurance policies that would kick in when disasters strike. The second has to do with directing funding towards multilateral development banks. And then the third is to provide grants to projects developed by climate vulnerable or B20 countries. So of these three, only the third fund meets the underlying principles of climate justice, which Ireland has committed to. In other words, the idea that polluters are the ones that must pay for their historic role in causing the crisis which has led to this loss and damage in the first place. The funding that's already been pledged by developed countries, moreover, is in the millions of dollars, which is really a mere drop in the ocean in terms of the scale of the needs. We also know that insurance-based mechanisms, such as the Global Shield, don't cover slow onset events like sea level rise, and they're not adequate to address the scale of the need. So think of the 40 billion in damages in Pakistan, for instance. We also know that the payouts don't cover the full cost of loss and damage. So Christian Aid has shown in our research that despite loss and damage to the cost of around $360 million caused by floods and drought in Malawi in 2015, and having purchased sovereign level insurance, the total payout was around 8 million. So this really illustrates that these kinds of events are uninsurable, as one of the presentations rightly made reference to earlier. The idea of policy perfectionism is also being deployed by developed countries, including the EU, which is basically a tactic to delay. And it's the idea that policymakers should only seek perfectly crafted solutions that are supported by all affected parties. So that's the delay tactic that's very much present in the talks at present. And just to end, I've come straight from the ministerial negotiations on loss and damage, which are currently taking place, and at which Minister Eamon Ryan is leading for the EU. But the Pakistan Minister of Climate Change, which is the last speaker I heard before leaving, stated that where the COP would basically lose all credibility if there's not a political agreement to set up a fund by the end of this week. And I'd have to say I fully agree with that sentiment. Thanks.
Ross, thanks so much for I guess highlighting the significant gap, emissions and financing gap between what's statements and ambition and what's in reality in terms of what's needed on the ground. Yeah. So I think it's really like in these latter moments of or days of COP27, and it's likely to run into Sunday. That from what I hear, we should keep I guess if we want to follow what is happening, we need to keep an eye on the cover decisions text, which will be, the key text that is negotiated. And there's a lot of elements that are expected to be in that, which are barometers of whether or not COP27 will be seen to be a success or not. And I think the students have shown, many of those issues that are, if they are reflected adequately in the cover text, then COP27 will be a success. And similarly, our commentators have pointed to kind of key and critical issues. So at that, I'd like to thank everybody. This is our last briefing, and I guess we can all keep monitoring and following the COP27 negotiations. I'd like to thank our students. I'd like to thank our faculty on the CCAFS, MScCCAFS program. I'd like to also thank Isabel for who's doing all of the comms in relation to this, and again all of our commentators who take time out of their time here at COP27 to give their perspective. So at that, thank you all, and let's hope for a positive outcome from COP27.